It was a small bruise under my left eye, almost nothing to the world. But to me it carried the weight of years I could no longer hide. My sister's eyes lingered on it when she came to sit with me, and in that moment, the silence between us felt louder than any words. She said nothing, and when she looked away, I saw my husband's smile curl at the corner of his mouth as if victory belonged to him. I sat there, holding my teacup, knowing the room was heavy with truths unspoken, and I wondered if this was the night my story would finally change. Thank you for watching and being here with me. I truly appreciate you, and please let me know in the comments where you are watching from. My name is Florence, and I live in California, and tonight I want to open my heart to you, because sometimes the only way to lighten a heavy burden is to share it. Even if the words come slowly and with a trembling voice. For years I tried to carry everything quietly, believing that silence kept peace. But silence can be heavier than stones when it hides pain. And that night with my sister sitting across from me proved it. I remember watching her fingers tremble as she set her cup down, and in that tiny motion I felt her fear, but I also felt her retreat. And it stung me more deeply than the bruise itself, because this was the woman who once held my hand through storms when we were little girls, the one who knew my laughter and my secrets. And yet, in that moment, she gave me nothing but the weight of her silence. My husband leaned back in his chair, as if the world belonged to him, confident that no one would ever challenge him, that no one would ever see through the wall he had built around me, and the air in that room grew so heavy I could hardly breathe. I sat with my teacup in my lap, trying to steady my hands, trying not to let my tears fall where he could see them, and I thought to myself, is this how the rest of my days will be? Living with bruises that fade on my skin, but never in my memory. Carrying a heart that aches for someone to speak up, but finding nothing but quiet. That night taught me that silence is a strange thing, because it can wound you when you expect comfort, but it can also hold power you cannot see. And in that uneasy stillness, my story began to shift in a way I never imagined. I often think back to the life that brought me here. Because stories like mine don't just begin with one bruise. They begin with years of choices, sacrifices, and small silences that slowly pile up until they feel like walls around you. My name is Florence, and I am a woman who has lived many seasons, and through each one I tried to carry myself with grace and strength. But even the strongest branches bend when the wind never stops blowing. I was married young, and in those early days, I believed I had found someone who would love me through every storm. But over time, the tenderness faded, and in its place came harsh words, cold looks, and the kind of control that steals your freedom little by little, without you even noticing it, slipping away. I worked hard, raised my family, and poured everything I had into making a home. Yet somehow that home became a place where I was more prisoner than partner. Walking carefully on every word and every step to avoid a storm I knew too well. It wasn't always like this, and that is what makes it harder, because I can still remember moments of laughter, small kindnesses, promises whispered late at night, but promises mean nothing when actions are knives. Slowly, the balance tipped, and I learned to endure things I should never have endured. A slammed door, a raised voice, money hidden away so I had to ask for what was mine, and then hands that once held me began to leave marks I had to cover with powder or long sleeves. For a long time I convinced myself it was just anger, stress, a passing storm, but deep inside I knew it was more than that. It was control. And I had allowed myself to shrink into someone who no longer recognized her own reflection in the mirror. When my sister came that evening, I thought maybe she would see me the way she used to, the way she did when we were little girls in California, running barefoot down the street, laughing without fear, trusting each other with every secret. She was always the brave one, the one who stood up for me when I was too timid to speak. And a part of me hoped that the moment she saw my face, she would rise up again, that she would remind me that I was not alone. But instead she stared for a heartbeat too long, and then looked away. And in that silence my heart cracked a little more. I felt as though the walls had closed in tighter, as though even the bond of blood had turned fragile in front of my husband's smirk. Still, something about her trembling hand lingered in my mind, because it told me that her silence was not indifference. It was something else, something I could not yet name. I wanted to cry out to her, to beg her with my eyes not to leave me in that darkness, but fear held me still. Fear of him, fear of shame, fear of what speaking up might cost me. I held on to my teacup as if it were the only anchor I had left. And in the quiet, I wondered what it must feel like to live a life where you can breathe freely, where your skin carries no secrets, and where silence is only peace, not prison. Little did I know that while I sat drowning in despair, the silence I hated so much was already shifting, already moving into something that would break open the cage I thought would hold me forever. That evening, after my sister left, I sat in the quiet of my room, staring at the reflection that no longer looked like the woman I once knew, and the silence in the house pressed against me like heavy walls that refused to let me breathe. My husband moved about with the confidence of someone who believed he had won, humming softly as if the world was his, and my pain meant nothing more than a victory he could savor. I touched the bruise under my eye and felt the sting of both the mark and the memory, because every bruise carries not just pain, but the weight of humiliation. The reminder that somewhere along the way you stopped being treated as a partner and became something to be controlled. I thought about how many times I had covered up, laughed off questions, or excused what should never have been excused, convincing myself that this was just part of life, when deep inside I knew that life was meant to be more than survival. As I sat there, memories came flooding back, of nights spent waiting for him to calm down, mornings pretending nothing had happened, days putting on a brave face for the world, while inside I felt smaller and smaller. I remembered birthdays where my smile hid behind tired eyes, anniversaries where silence filled the room instead of love, and long afternoons when I folded laundry with tears that slipped quietly down my cheeks so no one would see. That bruise under my eye was not the first, but it was the one that made me feel the deepest shame, because it was no longer a secret I could hide from the people who knew me best. My sister had seen it, her silence wrapping around me like cold air, and though it pierced me with disappointment, a small part of me could not let go of the trembling in her hands, the way her eyes had softened for just a moment before she looked away. I kept asking myself, why didn't she speak? Why didn't she reach for me? Why didn't she protect me like she once had? And the questions echoed in my chest until they felt unbearable. My husband's smirk as he leaned back in his chair came back to me over and over again, a look of satisfaction that chilled me to the bone, and I realized how much he thrived on silence, how much he relied on it to keep me under his thumb. The house was so still that I could hear the ticking of the clock, each second dragging as if the night would never end, and I sat with my thoughts, trapped between despair and the faintest flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, my sister's silence was not abandonment, but something else. I wanted to believe that in her silence she was planning, that she was stronger than her stillness suggested. And though I had no proof, I held on to that thought like a thread in the darkness, never knowing how close I was to the moment that would change everything. I sat on the edge of my bed with the dim light from the lamp casting long shadows across the room. And in that stillness, I began to understand how betrayal does not always come with loud words or cruel actions. Sometimes it comes dressed as silence, and it cuts just as deeply. My heart ached because I wanted to believe that my sister, the one who once shielded me when we were little girls, would stand for me again. Yet her eyes that night carried both fear and hesitation. And I could not tell if she had abandoned me, or if she was holding something I could not yet see. I thought of the way she used to brush my hair when I was too tired to lift my hands, the way she would slip me her last piece of candy when I was crying, and the way we once promised each other that no matter where life took us, we would always be each other's safe place. And those memories clashed painfully with the way she looked down at her teacup and said nothing. My husband's shadow loomed larger in my mind with every passing second, his quiet satisfaction pressing into me like a weight I could not lift. He had always been skilled at twisting silence into power, using it like a weapon to remind me of my smallness, to make me feel unseen and unheard. He thrived on the fear that silence created, and that night he wore it like a crown, convinced that my sister's wordless retreat had secured his dominion over me. I sat there listening to the faint sound of him moving around the house, each step a reminder of how much control he thought he had. And I realized that silence can sometimes be the cruelest sound of all, because it speaks of things left unsaid, of battles not fought, of truths ignored. Yet deep within me there was a whisper I could not silence, a whisper that told me this story was not finished, that maybe her trembling hand, her eyes that would not meet mine, were not signs of surrender, but signs of something else, something brewing quietly beneath her stillness. I clung to that thought even as tears burned my eyes, because hope is often all we have when the world closes in. I told myself that if she had truly turned away, she would not have lingered as she did, she would not have let her hands shake, and she would not have left with her lips pressed together as if holding back words too heavy to release. And though I could not know it in that moment, that faint whisper in my chest was right, because sometimes silence is not the end. It is only the pause before everything changes. As I sat there lost in the heaviness of my thoughts, I kept circling back to that single image of her hand trembling against the teacup. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was not the gesture of someone indifferent. It was the movement of someone holding back a storm inside themselves. I remembered how her voice used to carry strength even when she was afraid, how she could look danger in the eye and still protect me when we were young. And I could not let go of the possibility that maybe she had not left me in weakness, but had chosen a silence that was waiting for the right moment to break. My husband believed her, quiet meant defeat. He sat with the ease of a man who thought he had fooled not just me but the world, leaning into that smirk that haunted me long after she walked out the door. And he carried himself like someone untouchable, certain that nothing and no one could stand against him. I could feel the bruise pulsing beneath my skin as I pressed my fingers lightly to my cheek, and I whispered to myself that this was not the life I had dreamed of, not the future I had promised myself when I was younger and full of hope. But the world does not always give us what we dream of. Sometimes it hands us tests that strip us bare. I thought of the years I had spent enduring, of all the excuses I had made for him, and I wondered if my sister saw all of that in my face. If in her silence she was not turning away but gathering her own courage to do something I no longer believed could be done. The house around me felt like a cage, the ticking clock echoing in my ears, my husband's movements down the hall a reminder that he thought his control was permanent. And yet within me, there was the faintest flicker that maybe change was closer than I dared to believe. I wanted so badly to trust in her, to believe that she had not abandoned me to this fate. And as I lay back on the bed staring at the ceiling, I told myself over and over that silence is not always weakness. Sometimes it is a seed waiting to bloom in its own time. That night stretched on endlessly, but I could not shake the feeling that her silence was different, that it carried a weight that was not surrender but preparation. And though I could not prove it, something inside me clung tightly to the hope that she was not done with me yet. The night seemed to stretch longer than any I had ever known, and as I lay there in that still house, I felt every second pass like a weight pressing down on my chest, each moment reminding me that I was trapped between fear and the faintest spark of hope that would not let itself die. My husband moved about with the comfort of a man who thought he owned the silence, his footsteps steady, his voice humming low as if the entire world bent to his control. And I knew he believed the bruise on my face and the silence of my sister had secured his victory. I stared at the ceiling, my mind circling back to every sacrifice I had made, every moment I had chosen to stay, every time I convinced myself that tomorrow might be different, and the weight of those memories burned like fire in my chest. I thought of the woman I used to be, the one who laughed without fear, who carried herself with confidence, who once believed that love was meant to be safe. And I wondered when exactly she had disappeared, when I had allowed myself to shrink so small that even my own reflection looked like a stranger to me. The bruise on my skin was only the latest mark, but the ones that cut deeper were the scars no one could see, The doubts, the loneliness, the endless waiting for a kindness that never came. Yet even in that despair, I felt something shift, something small but steady. Because my sister's trembling hand would not leave my mind, and I told myself that maybe she had carried away with her not just the image of my pain, but also the resolve to do what I no longer could. I closed my eyes and whispered into the darkness that I could not live like this forever, that something had to change, and though I did not yet know how or when, I felt the truth of those words settle deep in my soul. My husband believed his smirk was the end of the story, but I felt it then, as if the air itself carried a promise that his false triumph would not last, that silence would not remain his weapon forever. I did not know it yet, but while I lay there gathering the fragments of my strength, the night was already moving toward a moment that would shatter the walls around me. A moment that began with a sound so simple yet so powerful that it made his certainty crumble. The sharp knock at the door that would change everything. The sound of that knock echoed through the house like thunder, sharp and steady, and it startled me so much that for a moment I forgot to breathe. Because in this house, knocks at the door never came with comfort. They came with fear, with questions, with the unknown. My husband looked up from his chair with irritation. The kind of annoyance that came from someone who believed he should never be disturbed. And he muttered under his breath as he moved toward the door, each step heavy with arrogance. I sat frozen on the edge of the bed, my heart racing in my chest, my hands clutching at the blanket as if it could shield me from whatever was waiting on the other side. The silence just before he opened the door stretched endlessly. And in that silence I felt the weight of years pressing against me, as though the life I had carried until now was balanced on the edge of what would happen next. When the door swung open, I could not see everything from where I sat, but I saw the way his body stiffened, the way his hand dropped from the handle, as though the strength had been drained from him in an instant. And I knew before I heard a single voice that whatever stood outside had shaken him to the core. My legs trembled as I rose and stepped into the hallway, and there, framed in the doorway, was my sister, her face calm, but her eyes burning with a fire I had not seen in years, and beside her stood two police officers whose presence filled the space with authority. Just behind them, a woman I had never met before, waited with a look of kindness and strength, her hands holding on to a set of bags I recognized as my own. In that moment, the world tilted, and for the first time in a long time I felt the grip of fear loosen around me, because my sister's silence had not been betrayal, it had been strategy. And the trembling of her hand earlier had not been weakness. It had been the weight of what she was about to do. My husband turned toward me with eyes wide, his smirk gone, his voice caught in his throat as he tried to find words that no longer held power. And I knew that the balance had shifted. I stood there with my heart pounding, realizing that the life I thought I would never escape was breaking open right before me. And all of it began with the sound of a knock that he thought was nothing, but that became the sound of his undoing. The sight at that doorway is something I will never forget, because it was as if the air itself shifted and every shadow that had haunted me for years began to retreat. My husband, who had always stood tall with arrogance, suddenly looked small, his confidence crumbling as the officers stepped forward, their voices steady, their presence filling the house with a strength that was not his. My sister's eyes found mine, and in them I saw not silence but determination, the kind that speaks without words, the kind that says, "I have you now, you are not alone." Behind her, the woman from the shelter gave me the softest nod, and in her hands were the bags I had packed in secret, bags I thought would never see the light of freedom, bags I thought I would never have the courage to carry out myself. My husband tried to gather himself, stumbling over excuses, his voice dripping with false innocence, claiming it was a misunderstanding, saying he loved me, that I was confused, but the evidence was already there, painted across my skin, etched into the quiet records my sister had kept. She had gathered more than I ever imagined. Whispers of arguments, recordings of raised voices, photographs that spoke truths louder than any denial he could muster. In that instant his smile turned hollow, and for the first time I saw him stripped of his power, caught in the very net of silence he had once thought would protect him. As I stepped closer to the door, my hands trembling but my steps steady, I felt something inside me rise, something I had buried for too long. My sister reached out, her hand warm against mine, and I felt the bond of blood and memory stitch itself back together in a way I thought was lost. I could not speak at first, my voice caught by years of holding back, but the look on her face said enough. And the tears that welled in my eyes were not only from pain, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that I was no longer fighting alone. That doorway became a threshold, not just to another room, but to another life. And as the officers spoke calmly to him, while the woman from the shelter gestured gently for me to come with her, I understood that this was the moment when everything I thought would hold me forever was finally breaking apart. My husband's voice grew desperate as the officer stepped farther inside, his words tumbling over themselves as he tried to weave lies into something that sounded like truth, insisting that I was exaggerating, that I had misunderstood him, that everything was normal, but nothing about the bruise on my face was normal. Nothing about the years of silence and fear could ever be called love. And in that moment, his excuses sounded as hollow as the walls he had built around me. I watched the smirk that once held me hostage vanish into panic, his eyes darting between the officers and my sister, and I felt the shift of power settle into the room, no longer his to hold. He reached for me with words, calling me by a name that used to belong to me, a name I had answered to with obedience. But hearing it now felt like a stranger's call, because the woman he thought he owned no longer existed. The officers were calm but firm, asking questions he stumbled to answer, and my sister's voice, steady and clear, carried more weight than I could have ever imagined. Her words outlining the truth she had gathered, the proof of every wound, every whisper, every night of fear. I stood there, my hands trembling at my sides but my spine straighter than it had been in years. And for the first time I realized that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it stands quietly until the right moment comes, and then it speaks with undeniable force. The woman from the shelter placed her hand gently on my shoulder, her presence grounding me, reminding me that I had somewhere safe to go, that the door behind me was no longer a prison, but an exit to freedom. My husband's protests grew weaker as the officers stepped closer, and when they finally told him to turn around, to place his hands where they could see them, I watched the man who once believed he held all the power falter, his arrogance breaking under the weight of the truth. I thought I might feel pity, but all I felt was release, as if every chain I had carried was being unlocked one by one. My sister never let go of my eyes, and in that silent exchange, I felt her promise that I would not have to face another night alone. That she had stood in the shadows not to abandon me but to gather the strength I had lost. And as the sound of handcuffs clicked into place, echoing through the same walls that had once held my cries, I felt the smallest, purest breath of freedom fill my chest, and I knew that something had ended, and something entirely new was just beginning. When the officers led him toward the doorway, his voice cracked as he tried one last time to pull me back, with pleas that no longer touched me. Words of apology mixed with anger, promises I had heard too many times before, and all I could feel was the strange emptiness that comes when a storm finally begins to pass. I stood in the hallway, my body trembling, but my spirit steadier than it had been in years, watching the man who once controlled every corner of my life be escorted out of it, his eyes wide with disbelief that the silence he had relied on had turned against him. My sister stepped closer to me, her hand finding mine, and in her grip I felt the years of distance melt away, her voice quiet but strong as she told me that I was safe now, that she had never stopped seeing me, that her silence had been her shield, until the moment was right to act. I could hardly hold back the tears as the woman from the shelter placed my bags gently at my side, the very bags I had packed in secret with shaking hands, thinking I might never have the courage to carry them out. Yet here they were waiting for me, ready to take me away from everything that had held me captive. For the first time in a long time, I felt the weight on my chest begin to lift. Not completely, but enough that I could breathe without fear. enough that I could believe in the possibility of tomorrow. My husband's voice still echoed faintly outside, but it no longer had power. It no longer wrapped itself around me like chains. And instead of shrinking beneath it, I straightened my shoulders and let it fall away into nothing. My sister's eyes glistened as she whispered that she was sorry for the silence, that every moment of it had been heavy on her heart. But she had needed to be certain. She had needed to gather when I could not. And though her silence had pierced me with pain, it had also built the bridge that led me here. I pressed her hand and told her that I understood, that sometimes love is not loud or quick. Sometimes it hides itself until it can strike with certainty, and in that truth, I found forgiveness. As we stepped together into the night air, I felt the chill of freedom brush my skin. And with each step toward the waiting car, I knew I was leaving behind not just a house but a life that no longer belonged to me. And in its place was the fragile but undeniable beginning of a new one. As I sat in the back seat of the car with my sister beside me and the woman from the shelter in the front, I felt a strange mixture of fear and relief wash over me. Because freedom is not always easy. Sometimes it feels unfamiliar, like stepping into a world you once dreamed of, but never believed you would touch. The house behind me still held my memories, my laughter, and my pain. And though part of me wanted to look back one last time, I kept my eyes forward, telling myself that the past no longer had permission to own me. My sister held my hand tightly, and in her touch I felt both her sorrow for the years she had been quiet and her strength for the years that lay ahead. And I knew that what she had done was not easy, that it had cost her nights of worry and fear, but she had done it anyway. And because of that, I was finally free. The drive was quiet, except for the sound of the engine, and in that quiet, I realized that silence no longer carried the same weight it once had. It was no longer a prison, it was peace. It was the sound of safety returning to me. The woman from the shelter spoke softly about the place we were heading to, a safe space where women like me could breathe again, where no one's voice would drown mine, where I could begin to rebuild not just my days, but my spirit. Her words wrapped around me gently, reminding me that I was not the first to walk this road, and I would not be the last. But each of us who dared to take that step was proof that silence could be broken. I leaned my head against the window and watched the streets pass by, each turn taking me farther from the life that once felt permanent, and with every mile I felt something inside me slowly unfold, like wings that had been pressed down for too long. I thought of the years I had lost, of the laughter I had swallowed, of the bruises hidden and the dreams forgotten. And though sorrow welled in my chest, it was joined by something new. Something I had not felt in so long that I almost did not recognize it. Hope. My sister squeezed my hand again and whispered that I was stronger than I knew, that she was proud of me. And in that moment, I allowed myself to believe her. Because sometimes the hardest part of surviving is remembering that you are worth saving. And as the car carried me farther from the shadows, I realized that I was no longer just leaving. I was arriving, stepping into a future where my silence would no longer serve him, but only me. When we reached the shelter that night, I stepped out of the car and felt the ground beneath me as if it were brand new. Because every step I took was no longer weighed down by fear, but carried by the promise of a tomorrow I had once thought impossible. Inside, the warmth of the place greeted me, and though the walls were unfamiliar, they already felt safer than the house I had left behind. My sister stayed close, her hand still holding mine, and I could see in her eyes the quiet apology for all the moments I thought she had abandoned me, but also the pride that came from knowing she had helped carry me here. I understood then that silence had been her weapon, her way of striking not with noise but with precision, and it had given me back my freedom. As I lay my head down that night, I told myself that the woman who entered that marriage was gone. The woman who endured in silence was gone, and in her place stood someone new, someone stronger, someone free. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. Your presence means more than you know. And if my truth has touched you, please subscribe and join me here, because more stories are waiting to be told, and I would be honored to share them with you.